Hey everyone, if you're a fan of the show, please head over to mikeyop.com and click the subscribe button. It's the best way to support us, and it's free. That's MIKEYOPP.com. Thanks!
Hi, I'm Mike Oppenheim, and you are listening to Coffin Talk, Exit Interviews with the Living, a weekly podcast that explores how our views on death affect the way we live our life. This week with me is a special guest, Christensen. He's also a podcaster. But first, let's just say hello to Chris. Chris, how's it going?
I'm still alive, so that's, giving the subject of the podcast, that's pretty good.
Excellent. Yes, and we have so far only had a live guest. We are definitely looking for that first dead one, so if you or anyone else has one, let us know. And my brother actually was booking my brother booked you rather for this podcast, and it's because he has gone on your podcast before. So I thought it'd be nice to start with that. Can you give us a little background, how you started your podcast, what it's called, where to get it?
Well, you say podcast. I have 2 active podcasts. I've had 5 before. So first you have to admit you have a problem. My longest running podcast that your brother has been on is Amateur Traveler, which is a travel podcast that has been in production since 2005, and every week talks about a different destination. And then I also do a faith-based podcast called the Bible Study Podcast.
And that's the one that's actually going to be more prominently talked about today.
Probably.
So.
Yeah.
But actually, let's just start with the kind of light material. I usually ask my guests, if they don't mind, to share what generation they think they come from and where they grew up.
What generation? Okay, well, I'm a late boomer officially because I was born in 1960, and I grew up in California, in rural California, in Salinas, which is an ag town.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm familiar with it. I'm from the Berkeley side of the Bay Area.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And so how did you get into traveling and podcasting? They're very different questions, but...
Right. So I got into traveling by exploring national parks with my parents as a kid, driving all over the West, pulling a little tiny 14-foot trailer, and that was, if you count the 3 feet of hitch. So little tiny trailer and lots of different trips there, including my first international trips, which were to Canada. And then later on, when podcasting started, I was listening since early on in podcasting, and it wasn't very long before I thought I ought to have a show. And I thought about doing a faith-based podcast, which I did eventually do a year later, and thought about doing a tech podcast because I'm a nerd. And then we had some friends over for Memorial Day picnic, and all the best stories were travel stories. So I started a travel podcast.
That's awesome. And I'm curious, were you told a lot growing up that you have a great voice for radio, or did you just naturally discover that, or was there any sort of push?
Maybe great face for radio, but no, I don't. I don't think I was necessarily told that.
Okay, well, you do. But anyway, it's.
Oh, thank you. My wife tells me that I've got my podcaster voice on. I don't notice it, but I'll go downstairs and she'll say, you're still talking in your podcaster voice."
That's great. That's awesome. And so much like you, I am a man of faith, and I am definitely involved and interested in exploring faith, all faiths, as a matter of fact. So let's get into yours for today's podcast. So how would you classify yourself?
Christian.
Okay. And was there any specialty, denomination, anything like that?
I currently attend and have most of my life attended a Lutheran church, but Protestant Christian is kind of my sweet spot there. A lot of my formative experiences in the Christian faith were in non-denominational groups, both in college and before that. So, more Protestant and Christian than any particular branch.
Great. And I think where I kind of want to start, and we're going to ramble and amble all over the place, but what is your earliest memory of having faith, of even using that word, that concept of like calling yourself a Christian?
Well, I grew up in the church, so I don't remember not. My parents actually met at a Bible study. My mom was the one who my dad, who was leading it, couldn't get her to participate as actively. So at a retreat, a Lutheran student retreat way back when he was in college, and she was already out because it took him longer. And so I grew up in the church. I'd say it became my faith probably when I was around somewhere in the 8 to 10 range.
And was there ever a time early on, and there might be one later, but I'd prefer to hear an early one, where your faith was tested, or where you thought about maybe leaving or finding a different faith?
No, not really. Not that I can think of. I'm tested maybe, but not really ever got that far away from it.
And so how was your childhood affected by your faith? Like, was it comfortable? Was it warm? Was it like a major part or just sometimes?
Yeah, it was a pretty major part. I mean, you'd know where to find us on a Sunday morning, and my parents are very loving and warm people. They, I still, when I go down and see them, they're still alive at almost 95 and almost 94. They, when I go down and meet the people where they live in their residence care facility, they tell me what nice people they are, and I agree. So, I grew up in a boring town like 95% of all boys. I think we all think we grew up in the most boring town in the world, but yeah, it was pretty. Looking back and with perspective, it was a pretty simple childhood and pretty easy from that point of view.
And so when has your faith and when has Christianity helped you in a time that wasn't easy? Can you give an example of like a profound or not even profound, but just important time for you?
Yeah, I mean, again, it'd be hard to find when it hasn't been in terms of when I have gone through times that haven't been easy. Right now we're in elder care, sort of time period, and so that's wearing. Obviously, times when we had little kids around were grueling at times. I don't think I remember the first year of my daughter's life because we had kids 17 months apart. We had some time periods where I would say were a little more stressing. Like at one point when my daughter was in junior high, she developed a blind spot in one eye, and we immediately have imaginations and enough knowledge to be dangerous in terms of health care to wonder what's going on. She didn't immediately realize until she was at the doctor with no bedside manner that one of the things they were worried about was brain tumors and things like that. And it was just one of those moments where I just felt confident, sure. I wasn't that as worried as I thought I would be in that situation. So those kind of moments, it is definitely a time that I lean on my faith, let's say.
Cool. And that's kind of where I want to start going with our time is maybe to push your memory, not to push you, into helping my listeners understand. Because again, like this, there's no one denomination that we subscribe to or like try to prophesize here. But what I am out to help people with is there's a constant fear of death. There's a constant fear of change even. And I find that religious people have their own version of how to deal with that. And so you just brought up a great one, which is the elder care. So if it's not too painful of a subject to talk about, what is your faith as far as like what does happen to people when they die?
I'm very traditional, biblical-based Christianity that there is a heaven, that there is a chance to be with God. So that is shouldn't be a surprise for anybody who's read the book. I don't know if you're waiting for the movie, but that's definitely what my faith is relative to that. So I'd say it's easier to face. My parents obviously aren't going to be around forever. Something about being almost 95, you just don't know how much time you have with them. They're in relatively good health for being that old, but when you look at I work in a fintech company, and I've had to look at the statistics from Social Security, for instance, for what life expectancy is. And when you're that age, it's always a year and a half. And then it sort of like gets down to, with every year, it seems like you lose a month. But, when you make it to 94, they think you're going to make it to 95 and a half. And when you make it to 95, it's sort of like 96 and, not quite a half. And so we don't know how much time we have with them. We've had Joan's mom, my wife's mom, live with us during the last 4 years of her life. She died in the front room, and in hospice care. And I understand you have experience with hospice care on the other side of that, and I have a great respect and, gosh, I don't understand how people can get into that. To be honest, it is but a great appreciation for those that do, because she was in hospice not for a long period of time. She was in hospice just for a couple weeks, as she just very rapidly went away. Uh, went from, gee, I think maybe she's going to get better to dying in a course of about 2 weeks. Enough time for family to get here. Now, she was someone who grew up in the church when she was a kid, and then married into a Catholic family where she really wasn't welcomed into the church because of the traditional differences between the denominations. But I don't think she really was a person of faith. That was probably a little harder dealing with death in her case than the upcoming death of my parents, because there's more of an issue with that relative to not being grounded in faith.
That was great, and that was really helpful for me to understand you, but also to understand something that I've actually long forgotten about, which is that any faith is going to help you in the end. It really is. And the people who don't think about it and don't see it coming, and then it blindsides them, it's really hard. As far as for how I got into hospice, I just had a lot of experiences as a young child with family friends getting sick and dying, and I just happened to tag along with my mom to a lot of them, and I just kind of got used to that. So it is why I started this podcast, and I am curious. Your faith is not per se controversial, but
well, that depends who you are, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. So how do you not how do you deal with other people of different faiths? I don't care about that at all. What I care about is, does it ever concern you that there are other religions with actually more members who are just as confident that their version of the afterlife is correct? Does it ever enter your mind that you could be right, they could be wrong, vice versa? Ever any doubts or anything like that?
Oh, I certainly thought about that. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about that, but if you're someone who travels, for instance, like I do, you certainly have gone to places where there is a more predominant, Hindu faith or more predominant Muslim faith or whatever. So that's certainly something I'm very aware of. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, honestly, because of more personal, experiential, times in my faith that uphold that faith, as it were.
And actually, I'd love for you to tell any example of that, just a time of...
Sure. Well, one of the things that I'd done for about 15 years before the pandemic is I was involved I'm still involved in a chaplain program to the jail population in our county. And both on the board and then also was volunteering for about 15 years in a lockdown unit for violent youth offenders in juvenile hall. And so I know a larger number of murderers and gangbangers than most people do. But that has also been a place where I have, seen faith grow. And the one story that I think of is there's a kid, and I don't want to name his name, obviously, because that's against the rules, even though he's now no longer a minor. But he started coming to the Bible study that I was leading, and he didn't want to be there, which was really weird because he didn't have to be there. It was one of those units where you could be playing handball, or you could be writing letters, you could watch TV, you could play video games. I was coming in an off hour when they didn't have anything, else. They had lots of else programmed. There was lots of other options. So it was very unusual to get somebody who really didn't seem to want to be there. And so he started coming, and he came for probably a month before he said more than 2 words. And then he started asking questions, and then I would come back, a week later, because I'm going on a weekly basis, and he would be reading something, and it's like he'd have questions about what he's reading, and you could see the faith growing in him. And it wasn't probably till I was there for about 6 months that I learned more of his story. And he was someone who had been abused by a parent and had set the house on fire with his father in it. And his father had died, so he was up on murder charges. But the reason he started coming to Bible study is he was in his cell, his room, one time, and the way he described it is the room filled up with light, and someone poked him in the chest and said, "You're going to Bible study." And if you'd told me that, if he'd come the first time and said, "This is why I'm here," it would have been one of those things that even as a person of faith, that would have stretched, it's like, okay, but by the time I heard him tell me that, I had been seeing the change. This kid was broken and closed when he started coming, and I saw him come back to life, as it were. I saw him change over the 6 months that I'd come to know him, and it finally made sense, right? It was sort of like, oh, okay. That is not an everyday thing that happens in my life. I don't know about your life, but it is one of those things that is the kind of things that you go, oh, okay, there's something to this faith. I think of years when I was in the non-denominational group, and we were in college, and I was one of the leaders of that, and we'd have needs for some particular, want to do a concert or something like that, where we needed some particular support. We didn't have like a email newsletter. This is pre-email, or something to go out and reach out to the alumni of the group or something like that. But we would, pray about it, and suddenly we would get a check in the mail from somebody who thought of us and wrote a check, and darn it, if it wasn't usually the right amount. So we're like, okay. So yeah, I mean, that's the kind of things that not necessarily big miracles in my life, but enough, if you're paying attention to undergird the faith that I have when you get through some of those difficult times.
Yeah, it's funny because I interact with a lot of, they call themselves atheists, and they'll say things, though, like, oh, there's a glitch in the matrix. This really strange coincidence happened, and it was the thing I was looking for. And, it's what you would call praying, and it's just very interesting to me because I think most people notice these things. They notice that there are just things that we could, of course, call a coincidence, but there seems to be something behind it. Very much switching gears, but it's going back to something you were talking about earlier. I do want to explore the darker and more negative side of the afterlife when it comes to Christianity. So I didn't ask you outright, do you believe that there's also a hell?
I do.
Okay. And so with that in mind, could you tell me how the knowledge and belief of hell has affected the way you live your life? So I'm not asking about other people, but just on a personal basis.
I wouldn't say that. So I didn't grow up in a hellfire and damnation sort of environment where, so I would say I neither believe that, I ought to be Christian so I don't go to hell. And I understand that is honestly the environment that some people grow up in within the Christian church. And then I also didn't grow up in the kind of environment that said that it's the evacuation plan, that Christianity is all about the evacuation plan. It's all about what happens later. And so my understanding that has developed over the 60 years that I've been around, and certainly not inconsistent with a lot of other people that I know, is that it's more the retirement plan. but that Christianity, that life is not really, when the Bible talks about heaven, it doesn't really talk about so for instance, they get more specific. At one point when Jesus is talking about, I've come that you might have life everlasting, and then when you die, that you can be with God. So it's two separate thoughts, connected obviously, but it's not that the life that you have starts when you die. It's that it starts now and continues when you die. So to me, hell is finally God gives you what you want of, I don't want anything to do with you, and withdraws from where you are, and that is what hell is. A place without the presence of God as much as God can be absent. And that all of the good things that we didn't accredit to him in life, go away. So I really see it more at, I don't think of it necessarily as punishment, just as the end of a life that is heading away from God.
Wow. No, that was profound. It was educational. I've never heard anyone phrase it that way. And I thought it was by far the most intellectually grokkable way to explain that I've ever heard. So I'm going to start repeating that to people. That was incredible. Thank you. I'm glad you lead groups and that you work with people, because that not only does that inspire me, but it actually sounds so plausible to me that I think it would really help people to hear that more often, that you have God's love right now and you really don't want to squander that.
Yeah, I mean, I think of the verses where, Jesus said, I've come that you might have life and have it abundantly. To me, I know some people, when they think of Christianity, and I understand this, and sometimes it's sold this way, is all the things you don't do.
Yeah.
If you're Puritan, for instance, that form of Christianity is the Christians are the people who don't do this, that, and the other thing. And I probably don't do some of those things, but that's not my understanding. It's not that I don't do, drugs or something like that because I think it's wrong, although I probably do, but I also find it unattractive, right? That I don't see that there is life in that choice. And I buy into the idea that we are making ourselves, whatever your faith background is or whatever, we are making who we will become through our choices every day. And some of those choices that I don't think will make me the kind of person I want to be. And I think of the old joke. So that, there's a story about the guy who's building houses, and he's working for somebody else, and it's going to be the last house he's going to build for them. And he decides that he's going to cut corners, and he's going to save the money, and he's going to, embezzle basically from his employer because he's been working for him for all these years. And what does he have to show for it? And so he, uses substandard this and substandard that, and, not as many 2x4s and all these things. And he finishes up the house thinking about this great money that he has squirreled away. And the guy he's working for says, I want to thank you for all the work you've done for me over the years. So it's your house.
That's awesome. Yeah.
And I think we often, act as if we're building somebody else's life, that we don't often use the intentionality that I think that building a life deserves.
That's great. I really like that. The house thing, I've never heard that before. And so I've never asked a guest this before, and I don't think you have the authority to answer, but I want to ask you anyway. Because many faiths believe that your soul is reincarnated, your soul has other lives. Like, where do you believe the soul originates? Like, did you choose to become a soul that became Chris, or like, what is your faith in that?
No, there's no real biblical basis for a existing soul, so much as something that is created from combination of mother and father, and where it resides in terms of physically. I'm not sure is the right question, but because I don't know that that's quite the what it is. Although I don't have any problem with science that tells me that a lot of my personality is in my brain and how it's wired and all those sorts of things. But I do believe that there is something more to it than that. But no, I don't see any place in the Bible that talks about a pre-existing soul in that fashion.
Yeah, and that makes sense to me. And the reason I was asking is because I love this idea of this continuum, and that hell is not an eternal place you go to because you're damned, but it's the absence of what we already have here on earth, and then heaven is an abundance of more of what we have. And so with that in mind, the child who's obviously now an adult that you mentioned, who started the fire and then started to have faith, is he still capable of going to heaven in your faith?
Sure. Otherwise, I'm really wasting my time being involved in prison ministry.
Yeah.
Well, and one of the nice things I like about being in prison ministry is that once you've gotten to that point, that you're involved because you don't believe that people are, that I can look at somebody and tell if they're predestined to go to heaven or hell. They may be, but I can't tell, and so I have to behave as if they're not. And because I'm definitely, if in that balance of, well, so there's a whole other discussion about predestination versus free will, because I don't think they're mutually exclusive. But definitely you get involved in prison ministry because you don't believe that anybody is beyond redemption. The good news is then you have to look at your friends and go, well, I guess they're not either, right? I thought of, think of friends who they broke up because of, something that happened and the marriage dissolved, and it was, quite possibly one of their faults. But if I can, sit with a kid who, killed his dad and say that God isn't done with him, why would I write off, one or either of the friends? And so it does affect how you look at everyone, I think, after that in a positive way.
Yeah, I remember reading that Jeffrey Dahmer's father visited him in prison every day until he was murdered, and people were like, "How can you do that? And he just said, I love him. He's my son. Why would I not show him love?" And I find it's very controversial to tell someone that you're not going to judge someone like even like Hitler or someone, some very like obvious example for most people. And so it's wonderful to talk to you today.
And I don't know that I wouldn't judge Hitler, right? Like, let's be honest here. It's, I'm human, and there's some people who do some amazingly despicable things, and it might be difficult for me not to be judgmental in that case. And I can't say that if I had been around in World War II and he died, I wouldn't have danced in his grave. Let's just be honest here. I think there's nothing redeemable that came out of that.
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean that it's not challenging.
Totally. But I think, I don't know, you've given me a healthy perspective today, and I'm thankful for that. And also, I just think it's funny because I can't imagine working with violent offenders, and you can't imagine working in hospice. And I think we're both doing different sides of a very similar job in both departments. So I want to thank you for doing that. It's pretty inspirational. Is there any last stories you want to tell before we run out of time here? Anything you want to say?
I don't have anything off the top of my mind. I'm sure I've got some other story if you had a particular topic, but I don't have a story that is urging to get out.
No, this was great, and I really just wanted to hear your take on everything. You're smart, you're sophisticated, you work in tech, you have like so many different hobbies and skills, and thank you again, Chris Christensen. You brought it all together for us today, so I want to thank you so much for helping us put another nail in the coffin. You are awesome, and people, please check them out. And for everyone else, we will see you next week. Walking alone when I walk into you, and I see that you see me, and I see you hear this tune, and I feel that you're near me, and I see you while the